Finally, we get to some theory. We've talked about how important theories of the state are, and now I want to shift the discussion more specifically to theory. The values, assumptions, and theoretical orientations that underpin the formulation and implementation of social policy is not always explicit, but they can be inferred and identified. By identifying the different orientations, theoretical and ideological, that can be expressed within a policy, we can take the first step in 1. Developing a critical appreciation of that policy, and 2. Imagining an alternative based on different values and theories. And it is only when we can imagine an alternative that we can move beyond accepting current policy orientations as givens. We can also understand such theories operating at different levels. So at the macro level, theories such as theories of the state, which is the subject of much of this talk, meso-level theories such as how governments operate in making and implementing policies, and micro-level theories such as how individuals or groups mobilise support or don't. In this lecture, we will concentrate on theories of the state, and in so doing, try and link theoretical material back to the policy issues identified earlier, oral health policy. We might understand power in the state from the perspective of essentially 2 points of view, an elite view and a pluralist view. Elite theorists, fairly obviously, see power in a society as being monopolised by a small minority. Elite theorists are, above all, interested in the decision makers, those they see as holding power. A classical contribution was made by Michels back in 1962, who took the concentration of power in the hands of an elite as a necessary outcome of a complex organisation. He thought up the famous iron law of oligarchy, in which modern societies' political parties need to be highly structured and oligarchic, run by the leaders such that the bulk of members are excluded from decision-making. By the way, oligarchy simply means rule by a small few. Other developments by theories such as Schumpeter back in 1943 saw democracy as nothing more than the competition between political parties for votes. Democracy does not mean rule of the people, but the fight for votes, followed post-elections by professional politicians being allowed to rule, assisted by a strong, independent bureaucracy. A radical version of elite theory was developed by a very famous sociologist called C. Wright Mills, writing in 1956, who wrote a book about American politics which has endured through decades, called The Power Elite. He also wrote the fabulous book The Sociological Imagination in 1959. In the book The Power Elite, he coined the notion of the military-industrial complex. This was the coordinated efforts of 3 elites, the military, the corporate, and the political, which have concentrated and unified power. Between them, these 3 rule the masses with the help of one-way communication via the mass media, so that inevitably ordinary people are made ignorant and not in control of their lives. The cohesiveness and unity of the power elite is strengthened by the similarity of the background of its members and the interchange and overlapping of personnel between the 3 elites. Members are drawn largely from the upper strata of society. They are mainly Protestant, native-born Americans from urban areas in the eastern United States. They share similar educational backgrounds and mix socially. As a result, they share similar values and sympathies which provide a basis for mutual trust and cooperation. What of Australia? Can aspects of Mill's view be applied to Australia? The answer is partially. Researchers have suggested that Australia has no comparable military elite. Nevertheless, the majority of those who occupy elite positions in Australia are recruited from the minority of the population with privileged backgrounds. So think politicians, judges, senior public servants, senior military officers, and directors of large companies and the major banks. There are high levels of self-recruitment in that the children of elite members are particularly likely to be recruited to elite positions. Elites are also likely to have common educational backgrounds. Michael Pusey has argued from his empirical work on elite Commonwealth public servants that their privileged social and educational backgrounds survive 20 years' experience in the workplace, shaping their social and political attitudes. In addition to a commitment to the status quo, the more privileged the background of members of Australia's bureaucratic elites, the more they are likely to be the most ungenerous, individualistic, tough and antisocial. That's a quote from Michael Pusey. Someone who is more sanguine or optimistic than Pusey about the role of elites was a very influential sociologist, Sol Ensel, and he argued the public service bureaucracy should be seen as central to the operation of power in Australia. He emphasised the dependence of private economic development on state action and intervention. Much of his work was involved with describing the bureaucratic ascendancy, which developed historically into a powerful, independent political force. While he did uncover elites, they did not really constitute a ruling class, but were more a loose collection of elite groups linked together by what he called a governing consensus. So a question: what would elite theorists say about our approach to oral health policy? So think here about vested interests, political motivations, corporate motivations, etc. Moving on to the pluralist theorists. Unlike elite theory, pluralism tends to see citizens actively involved in politics. For pluralists, politics is a matter of competing interest groups, none of which dominates over any of the others, since all have access to resources of different kinds. They see the state as a set of competing and conflicting institutions, rather than a monolithic entity which exerts power over the rest of us. In other words, power is much more decentralised, and the state is much messier than elitists might assume. Governing involves endless bargaining in order to influence policy, and policy is little more than a compromise between differing interest groups. Since the earlier formations, pluralists have revised their originally somewhat naive view of the openness of liberal democratic politics. Neo-pluralists such as David Held argued that corporate elites have more influence than other groups. However, they argue that the elite is not unified, nor is it capable of manipulating citizens into accepting elite rule. Pluralists argue that political parties in democratic societies are representative because the public directly influences party policy, since in order to be elected to government, parties must reflect the wishes and interests of the electorate in their programs. If existing parties do not sufficiently represent sections of society, a new party or independence will usually emerge. So think here the Greens, One Nation and Teal Independence. Parties are accountable to the electorate since they will not regain power if they disregard the opinions and interests of the public. Parties cannot simply represent a sectional interest since, to be elected to power, they require the support of various interests in society. Pluralists see interest groups as necessary elements in a democratic system for a number of reasons. Voting in elections involves only minimal participation in politics. This minimal level of participation is considered too little for a strong and vibrant democracy. Interest groups provide the means for citizens to participate more fully, and in doing so, to enrich democracy. Interest groups also provide a means to channel discontent and to give voice to those whose party lost an election. So interest groups are simply organisations that involve themselves in activities aimed at shaping, developing and implementing public policy. There are numerous ways of classifying interest groups on the basis of proximity and influence over government, for example, or geographic orientation of the organisation in terms of whether it operates at the local, federal or international level, or on the basis of the types of issues it pursues, for example, whether these are single issues, sectional interests specific to a particular group, or promotional groups who claim to promote particular ideas and values. There is, of course, danger of over-categorisation, and as with most classifications of social phenomena, the boundaries between the groupings aren't always clear-cut, and the distinctions between them can break down if one pushes too hard. Some form of structure or framework is nevertheless useful in terms of helping sort out the differences between organisations, their purpose, role and function. Singleton, Aitken, Jenks and Warhurst outline 3 types, and these categories are fairly typical across the literature. So 1, promotional groups. These promote a cause they think everybody should favour. They claim to promote particular ideas and values. Promotional groups exist to promote such ideas and causes as women's rights, environmental preservation and protection of animals. This category would include charities, the Council for Civil Liberties, the RSPCA and environmental or cultural groups. Membership is open and anyone is eligible to join. 2, sectional groups. These are the organisations that defend the interests of particular groups or sections in the community. Trade unions, employers associations, farmers organisations, Indigenous rights groups, etc., etc. Membership is only open to those who belong to that particular section of the community. Sectional groups include producer groups involved in the production of goods and services in the mainstream economy. Trade unions and employer groups are the main examples. Employer groups are such entities as the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Industries Group, and a range of specialist groups representing producers in various industries. Other sectional groups may be based on occupations, such as groups representing particular professions like doctors, lawyers, and social workers. Hybrid groups. These are the organisations that seem to display elements of both types of interests, promotional and sectional. The RSL, for example, is concerned with the care and protection of returned soldiers, but it also promotes a vigorous defence policy and was active in the Republican debate. Churches too have a religious function, but they are also vocal on particular issues. An alternative framework is offered by Marsh, who identifies 4 types of interest groups. So producer groups is the first grouping. These represent individuals involved in the production of goods and services in the mainstream economy. Trade unions and employer groups are the main examples. Welfare state client groups are the second category. These are organisations that represent people suffering a particular disease. So, for example, diabetes, kidney disease, etc., or forms of disadvantage. Some are large. For example, the Australian Pensioners Federation has a membership of 80,000 people. ACOS is another of these, representing service providers and consumer groups. It is an umbrella group representing 60 subgroups. Other examples are the National Action Coalition for Housing and the Combined Pensioners and Superannuation Associations of New South Wales. It should be noted that, like ACOS, many of these operate on government funding, and during the Howard years in particular, many of these groups were defunded. Welfare state provider groups is third grouping. These are broadly of 2 kinds: health and education providers and welfare agencies. Health and education providers are represented by at least 9 peak groups, while voluntary welfare agencies have at least 11. These are large, well-organised and well-funded with substantial staff and extensive representation and campaigning experience. Many maintain national offices in Canberra. Other professional groups is the fourth category. These perform educational, credentialing and occupational regulation functions, as well as advocacy. Examples are the Australian Association of Social Work, the AASW, the Law Society, the Institute of Chartered Accountants. The differences between the two, so Singleton's framework and also Marsh's framework, is that the former categorisation is framed in terms of the types of interests, and the second focuses much more on the type of organisation. Another variant on interest groups are issue or social movements. These are similar but larger. Since the 1960s, some of the issue movements that have emerged in Western democracies include the women's rights movement, the environment movement, consumer and gay rights, and animal rights, for example. The most prominent and largest is the Green Movement, covering a range of international, national and local organisations. Examples are the Wilderness Society, Greenpeace, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, Friends of the Earth. All of these are large, sophisticated, well-organised and wealthy. There are many examples of the power of interest groups over policy decisions and processes. One example is the peak industry body for mining companies throughout Australia called AMEC, and, for example, their extensive advertising campaign against the 2010 mining tax resource. Another is the gambling lobby group, Clubs New South Wales, Fierce Resistance to Gambling Reforms, which has included an orchestrated campaign to remove a senior member of Parliament, and that's referencing a Four Corners episode back in March 2023. No doubt you can think of many other examples, all of which clearly illustrate the centrality of power in decisions made by the state. In other words, you can't understand the government's policy position on issues without understanding power and vested interests. What conclusions can be drawn from these groups and their operations about political power in Australia? Ian Marsh, a prominent Australian political scientist, reaches 5 conclusions. 1. Membership numbers and commitments seem as significant as financial resources in effective political action. 2. The ability to organise is itself a significant aspect of power. 3. Ideas and images are powerful resources in political campaigning. 4. Nearly all interest groups have exhibited endurance in pursuit of their goals. 5. All enjoy access, in greater or lesser degree, to the formal machinery of government through membership of advisory bodies, consultative panels, and the likes. So some questions to consider. What would the interest group theories say about the responses from gambling groups about gambling reforms? How could we respond to each of the 5 points that Marsh makes about political power? The responses to these seem reasonably obvious when we're thinking about the gambling sector, and perhaps also the mining sector, and their political power. What about those in need of public dental health care and their political power? What mechanisms and resources come into play to represent their needs and interests? What does all this have to do with social work? Where does social work fit in? In conclusion, the existence and proliferation of interest groups and issue movements challenges the traditional assumptions about representation and challenges elite theories. In reality, contemporary Australian society is pluralised and fragmented. Interest groups and social movements are a principal cause and a symptom of this. Some suggest that interest groups and issue movements are set to enter a new phase in the development of Australian democracy, particularly as community disaffection with the major political parties continues to grow. What can we conclude about power, theories of power, and the Australian state? The empirical evidence would seem to suggest that both elite and pluralist theories are correct. Elites do exist, and different interest and issue groups are actively representing their voices in the political processes and to the state. A question remains, and I'm going to end the lecture with this point, about what groups, interests and issues are most likely to be successful in the contemporary era, and who is unlikely to be heard by the state. In particular, what do these theories suggest about the capacity or willingness of policy to respond to the issues and needs of low-income and disadvantaged Australians with whom social workers are likely to work?